Meryl Streep reveals the heartbreaking truth about Don Gummer, and fans are in tears. For more than 40 years, Meryl Streep and Don Gummer were held up as one of Hollywood's quiet miracles, a love that endured while so many others faded under the weight of fame and time. She spent a lifetime portraying devotion, sacrifice, and loss on screen. Yet her own marriage unfolded far from cameras, guarded with intention, and shaped by years of shared history. To the public, it looked steady, even unshakable. Still, what appeared complete was only part of the story. Now at 76, Meryl Streep has finally chosen to speak in her own way, revealing a truth that changes how that long marriage is understood. It is not a story of sudden endings, but of something slowly slipping away, while the world continued to believe in a lasting promise. What finally led her to acknowledge this moment, and what does it reveal about the love she held onto for so long? Before the awards, before the standing ovations, before her name became synonymous with greatness, Meryl Streep chose a life partner who wanted none of that attention. Don Gummer was not an actor, not a producer, not someone drawn to the glow of premieres or red carpets. He was a sculptor, trained at Yale, devoted to physical materials and the long, patient process of shaping something solid with his hands. While her world would become defined by scripts and stages, his remained grounded in studios, tools, and silence. Their paths crossed in 1978, introduced through family rather than fame. At the time, Meryl Streep was still becoming who the world would later celebrate, and Don Gummer was already rooted in a discipline that demanded focus and solitude. What drew them together was not ambition, but balance. He offered steadiness, she brought intensity. Together they formed a partnership that felt deliberate rather than dazzling. They married on September 30th, 1978, beginning a union that would last 45 years. From the outside it appeared almost defiant of Hollywood patterns. Don Gummer continued his work as a sculptor, earning respect in art circles without chasing celebrity, while Meryl Streep's career rose at a pace few had ever seen. She collected roles that explored love, regret, loss, and endurance, yet her own marriage remained protected from public interpretation. What made Don Gummer distinct was his absence from the narrative people expected. He did not follow her into interviews or award speeches, except when she invited him there with intention. When she stood on stage in 2012 and thanked him during her Academy Award acceptance speech, her words carried weight because they were rare. She credited him not for a role played, but for a life built, saying that everything she valued most had come from him. It was a declaration rooted in years, not moments. As her fame expanded through the 1980s and 90s, Don Gummer chose consistency instead of proximity to the spotlight. His sculptures appeared in museums and public spaces, often large, abstract forms that required time and patience to understand. In many ways his art mirrored his presence in her life. It was not loud, it did not explain itself, it endured. Together they raised 4 children, choosing family over spectacle. Their home life stayed largely private, a boundary they protected for decades. While headlines tracked her nominations and wins, her marriage unfolded without commentary, defined by routine, compromise, and shared responsibility. That privacy became part of the myth, the idea that some love stories survived because they refused to be consumed. Yet even then, the contrast was always there. One life was public, constantly examined and praised. The other was inward, measured by progress few people ever saw. That difference worked for a long time, perhaps because neither tried to change the other. He did not follow her path. She did not leave hers behind. This was not a marriage built on grand gestures or public affirmations. It was built on presence, on choosing the same person repeatedly while the world shifted around them. For years that choice seemed unbreakable. But when 2 lives grow in different directions, even love that once felt permanent can begin to change. And the question that lingers is not how long it lasted, but whether endurance alone is enough when closeness slowly fades. From the earliest years of their marriage, Meryl Streep and Don Gummer approached life together with an understanding that fame would never be the center of their home. She was building one of the most demanding careers in film history, while he remained committed to a quieter calling that required long hours, physical labor, and deep concentration. The balance they struck was intentional, and for decades it held. As her career accelerated through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Meryl Streep became a constant presence in American cinema. Awards followed, recognition multiplied, and expectations grew heavier with each new role. Yet behind that public ascent, the structure of her personal life stayed remarkably steady. Don Gummer did not accompany her everywhere, and he did not shape his identity around her success. Instead, he preserved a sense of normalcy that allowed their family to function outside of Hollywood's orbit. They welcomed 4 children over the years, and parenthood became the shared project that grounded their marriage. Raising a family required coordination, compromise, and sacrifice, especially with one parent frequently away on film sets. Their solution was not spectacle, but negotiation. Meryl Streep later described marriage as an ongoing effort, built on goodwill, and the willingness to bend, a philosophy that reflected lived experience rather than theory. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, her career showed no signs of slowing. Roles continued to arrive, and the industry treated her with a level of reverence few actors ever receive. Still, she spoke rarely about her private life, and when she did, it was measured. In a 2002 interview, she emphasized that there was no guidebook for balancing work and family, only constant adjustment. Love, in her view, was not a fixed state, but something sustained through effort. Don Gummer remained consistent in his absence from the spotlight. His sculptures gained recognition in their own right, appearing in museums and public installations, yet his name was seldom attached to hers in headlines. That separation of identities allowed the marriage to exist on its own terms. He was not competing with her visibility, and she was not attempting to pull him into a world he had never sought. For many observers, this arrangement became proof that long marriages could survive fame. Their relationship was often cited as an example of stability, not because it was dramatic, but because it seemed quietly functional. They did not sell their story, and they did not defend it. They simply lived it. Over time, endurance itself became the defining feature of their union. Decades passed, milestones accumulated, and the marriage carried the weight of shared history. 45 years is not sustained by romance alone. It is held together by habit, loyalty, and the decision to continue showing up even when life becomes uneven. Yet endurance can also mask change. A relationship can remain intact while its shape slowly shifts. The public saw longevity and assumed closeness, but the truth of any long marriage is more complex than what survives on the surface. As the years went on, the question was no longer whether their marriage would last, but what it had quietly become beneath the years of commitment and care. Long marriages rarely end with a single moment. More often, they change in ways that are almost invisible, shaped by time rather than conflict. For Meryl Streep and Don Gummer, there was no public rupture, no announcement, no moment the world could point to and say this is when it happened. Instead, the distance arrived slowly, settling in while life continued to move forward as it always had. By around 2017, their lives had begun to separate in practical ways. This shift was not explained or acknowledged publicly, and for years it passed without notice. They still shared a history, still shared children and grandchildren, still shared the weight of everything built across decades. What they no longer shared was the daily closeness that once defined their marriage, the quiet routines that hold two lives together over time. The last public appearance they made together was at the Academy Awards in March of 2018. On the surface, nothing seemed different. Meryl Streep continued her career with the same composure and presence audiences had always known. Don Gummer simply stopped appearing beside her. His absence did not invite immediate speculation because it aligned with how he had lived much of his life already, away from attention and far from ceremony. As years passed, the pattern remained. Streep attended premieres, festivals, and public honors alone. Interviews focused on her work rather than her personal life. Don Gummer remained devoted to his art and his privacy. The marriage was still legally intact, still treated with discretion, still shielded from public examination. There was no urgency to explain what had changed, perhaps because there was no single explanation to offer. For fans, belief filled the silence. A marriage that had lasted more than 4 decades carried its own authority. People wanted to believe that endurance meant closeness, that longevity meant nothing essential had shifted. As long as no one said otherwise, the story remained intact. What stands out most about this period is how deliberately quiet it was. In an industry where personal revelations are often expected, Meryl Streep chose restraint, not because there was something to defend, but because the truth of the situation belonged to those living it. Distance does not always arrive with conflict. Sometimes it comes with understanding. Don Gummer continued shaping his life outside the spotlight, just as he always had. His work as a sculptor remained steady, focused, and largely unseen by the public. Meryl Streep continued acting, earning acclaim well into later chapters of her career. From the outside, both lives appeared full and purposeful. What was missing was not meaning, but shared space. This kind of separation resists simple explanation. There was no public disagreement, no betrayal, no moment of blame that could neatly explain the change. Instead, there was time, evolution, and the recognition that the shape of their relationship no longer matched the lives they were living. For more than 6 years, this truth remained unspoken, not because it was hidden, but because it was never offered. The world assumed permanence because permanence had once been real. Only later would it become clear that what endured was not the marriage itself, but the care and respect that remained between them. The distance between them was not sudden. It unfolded gradually, with restraint and care. And in that silence, a different kind of ending took shape, one defined not only by loss, but by the resolve to let something meaningful change without turning it into a spectacle. For years, silence protected the shape of Meryl Streep and Don Gummer's private life. Then, in October of 2023, that silence was gently lifted, not through an interview or a personal statement, but through a confirmation from a representative that quietly reframed everything people thought they knew. The message was brief, measured, and unmistakably restrained. Meryl Streep and Don Gummer had been separated for more than 6 years, and while they would always care for one another, they had chosen lives apart. There was no anger in the wording, no finality meant to shock, just a clear acknowledgement of something that had already been true for a long time. The revelation did not expose a hidden conflict, but it clarified a long absence. What many assumed was togetherness had, in reality, become something else entirely. What struck people most was not the separation itself, but how long it had been quietly lived. More than 6 years had passed without explanation, without correction, without any attempt to manage public perception. In an era where personal updates often arrive instantly, this truth had been allowed to surface only when it needed to, and not before. Even then, the story resisted easy interpretation. Around the same time the separation became public, Meryl Streep was seen wearing her wedding ring. The image carried weight, not because it contradicted the announcement, but because it complicated it. A ring does not always signify the present. Sometimes it honors the past, the years invested, the promises once kept, and the respect that remains even after a relationship changes shape. Only weeks earlier, on September 30th, 2023, Meryl Streep and Don Gummer had reached what would have been their 45th wedding anniversary. 45 years is not a milestone that disappears simply because two people no longer share a home. It carries memory, family, and a shared history that does not dissolve on command. The timing of that anniversary, paired with the confirmation of their separation, underscored how layered their story truly was. There was no declaration of heartbreak in the traditional sense. No explanation of what went wrong. What emerged instead was a quieter truth, one that reflected maturity rather than drama. The language made it clear that this was not a story of bitterness or betrayal. It was a story of choice, made after years of shared life, to move forward separately, while still holding regard for what had been. Fans responded with emotion not because they felt deceived, but because the reality felt familiar. Many recognized themselves in the idea that love does not always end in anger. Sometimes it ends in understanding. Sometimes it changes without losing its meaning. That recognition carried its own weight. Meryl Streep did not step forward to narrate the separation herself, and she did not need to. The confirmation was enough. It respected the past without romanticizing it, and acknowledged the present without diminishing what came before. In doing so, it revealed something more lasting than a headline. It showed a version of love that did not collapse when it changed. The truth, when it finally surfaced, was not devastating because it was sudden. It was moving because it was measured. After decades of privacy, the acknowledgement arrived with the same restraint that had defined their marriage all along. What people learned was not that something had broken, but that something had evolved, quietly, over time. And in that moment of clarity, the story shifted. Not toward loss alone, but toward acceptance. Not toward an ending filled with regret, but toward one shaped by dignity, memory, and the understanding that even lasting love can take a different form and still be honored. The reaction to Meryl Streep and Don Gummer's truth was not loud, but it was deeply felt. There were no dramatic headlines driving outrage, no sides to take, no blame to assign. Instead, what emerged was something quieter and more personal. For many fans, especially those who had followed her life and career for decades, the story landed with an ache that felt familiar. This was not just about a famous marriage ending. It was about the idea that even the longest love stories can change shape, not because they failed, but because time reshapes everything it touches. For an audience that has lived through long marriages of their own, the revelation felt less like celebrity news and more like recognition. It mirrored lives built over years, promises kept for as long as they could be, and moments when holding on meant learning to let go. Meryl Streep had always represented endurance. On screen, she portrayed women who carried grief, responsibility, and resilience with grace. Off-screen, her marriage to Don Gummer became part of that image. 45 years stood as proof that commitment could survive careers, distance, and change. When fans learned that the marriage had quietly shifted years earlier, it challenged the idea that longevity alone defined success. What made the truth emotional was its restraint. There was no attempt to reframe the past as a mistake, no suggestion that the love they shared had been misplaced. Instead, the acknowledgement honored what had existed without pretending it could remain unchanged forever. That balance resonated deeply with people who understood that love does not disappear simply because circumstances evolve. For many women watching, this story reflected their own experiences. Relationships that lasted decades, partnerships that transformed as children grew, careers shifted or priorities changed. Endings that did not come with betrayal, but with fatigue, distance, or quiet acceptance. Seeing that reflected in a figure as admired as Meryl Streep gave those experiences a kind of validation. Don Gummer's continued privacy also played a role in the emotional response. He did not step into the public conversation. He did not offer a counterpoint or explanation. His silence reinforced the sense that this was never meant to be a spectacle. The story remained contained, respectful, and focused on truth rather than reaction. What fans responded to most was the dignity of it all. A marriage that began in 1978, survived decades of change, and ended not with anger, but with mutual care. A separation acknowledged only when it needed to be, and not turned into a narrative of regret. That approach felt increasingly rare in a world that often demands exposure. The tears were not for what was lost, but for what was recognized. The realization that love can be real, lasting, and meaningful, even if it does not stay the same forever. That commitment does not always end in celebration or collapse. Sometimes it ends in understanding. In the end, this story was never about disappointment. It was about honesty. It was about accepting that long lives carry many chapters, and not all of them look the way we imagined when they began. For fans who grew up alongside Meryl Streep's work, that truth felt personal, and perhaps that is why it lingered, not as heartbreak alone, but as reflection. Meryl Streep and Don Gummer's story was never meant to fit a simple ending. It began in 1978, with intention and care, carried through decades of shared life, and eventually changed in a way that remained private until it needed to be understood. What endured was not a public image of perfection, but something quieter and more lasting. Their marriage was built on choice, not performance. It survived fame, distance, and time, and when it could no longer continue in the same form, it ended with dignity rather than drama. That truth, once known, reframes the story not as a loss alone, but as a testament to respect and shared history. For those who watched her career unfold and believed in the strength of that partnership, the revelation offers something honest and familiar. Love can be real, it can last, and it can change without erasing what came before. For more emotional stories, check out this video.